Hey everyone, it's Russ, and welcome to another episode of Women's Retirement Radio. Today, I'm really happy to be joined by a friend of a few years, as well as a fellow professional that happens to work with a lot of women like I do, Ronnie Genser, who created and runs an interesting company called Bereavement Navigators. So, Ronnie, welcome.
Thanks so much, Russ. So let me tell you a little bit about myself. But I want to talk about first, prior to founding Bereavement Navigators in 2012, my professional background included over 20 years in international and domestic sales, marketing, training, and consulting. In addition to my sales and marketing career from during the period of 2006 to 2018, I served on the board of directors of the Lewy Body Dementia Association, which my mother had, that disease, for approximately 12 years. As a board member and subsequent volunteer over a 5-year period from 2006 to 2011, I created the Lewy Body Dementia Support Group network of almost 100 support groups, which span 36 states in the province of Ontario, Canada. This support group network continues to provide families and caregivers the resources to cope with the life changes wrought by Lewy body dementia, an incurable progressive disease that currently ravages 1.3 million Americans. However, big point here, my international and domestic sales and marketing career path took an unexpected turn after the sudden death of my husband, Dr. Sandy Weinberg, an associate professor of healthcare management at Clayton State University here in Metro Atlanta, as well as an internationally renowned FDA regulatory affairs consultant to the pharmaceutical, medical device, and biologics industry. He died unexpectedly on October 8th, 2011, so it'll be 10 years this year, at age 61 after complications from a heart attack, having spent 2 days in the ICU at Northside Hospital here in Atlanta and 7 days in the cardiovascular ICU at St. Joseph's Hospital. A little more information about myself with hopefully a little humor here is we married in our early 50s. It was my husband's second marriage, my first. So I called myself a first time, here's the humor, hopefully, albeit menopausal bride. We were married for 10 and a quarter years.
Yeah, well, thanks for sharing that, Ronnie. I think that paints a pretty colorful picture of both your background professionally, but also gives our listeners a little bit of an insight into your personal background. And I know it's no accident that you mentioned your husband's unexpected death, as that has, I think, I don't want to take words out of your mouth, but I think that's really informed and led to a lot of what you do today. So why don't you tell us a little bit about what Bereavement Navigators is and the work that you do and the people that you serve?
Perfect. Yeah, and you're correct. That absolutely has impacted my life completely. This was obviously, my business was not planned before this event, and it was even a couple of years after the death of my husband that I was encouraged to do this type of work. So the things I learned about what I needed to do after Sandy's death, including how to organize the numerous and unexpected tasks, the resources I found, and the tips I learned, I now share in my work as what I call a bereavement navigator with widows, widowers, adult children, and other relatives or friends who have lost a loved one, in hopes that my knowledge will make the myriad of tasks and the journey ahead easier for them. Since for me, it was, I did not have any friends who were widows or widowers when my husband died. This work is similar to what a Sherpa does, someone who guides and helps people navigate in places and situations they have never been in before. However, because my experience also taught me that being well prepared before death is one of the greatest gifts you can give a loved one or a friend if the friend is taking over for you, I also work with healthy couples, partners, and individuals to help them prepare, or in some cases better prepare, their affairs long before they experience a short-term or long-term incapacitation, such as a broken arm. It could be a broken arm, where in the short term they can't pay bills on their computer, or a long term, such as a dementia diagnosis, or even their own death. This work sometimes is I refer to this work sometimes as succession planning of a different kind, because it in many ways is similar to a lifeboat drill, because for many people, it not only becomes a wake-up call, but it also affords their loved ones an opportunity to practice what they'll face in the future while realizing there is no perfect preparation. There's always something that we forget to tell our loved one about about what we own, or where something is, or a password, or whatever. There's no perfect preparation, but at least if they do the work, then beforehand, that things will go so much easier than they did for me. As a result, my goal is to offer my clients and their loved ones the priceless gift of peace of mind, knowing the potentially myriad of tasks their loved ones will face will be much easier, less time consuming, and most importantly, less stressful.
So you covered a lot there. Some of the main things I took away is it sounds like kind of being thoughtful, thinking ahead, planning and thinking through maybe the steps that need to be taken or maybe planned for in the event of a death or as you mentioned, even maybe a short-term disability, depending on the people's circumstances. But from your perspective, Ronnie, what would you say is the biggest challenge that you help people address or solve through your work at Bereavement Navigators?
Yeah, Russ, before I address that, I want to say both, I should have mentioned it before, but both short-term and long-term incapacitation. So long-term incapacitation would be something like a dementia disease or something like that. So I wanted people to just, I guess I mentioned short-term before, because I think it's one of the things people don't realize, especially if you're healthy, never think about,
Right.
that could happen. And it isn't a death, and the person's probably going to get well, but it does happen. So I'll go on and say, to answer your question about the biggest challenge that I help people address or solve. What I'd like to do is to talk about the two major service offerings that my business offers, because it really is, they're two different, in marketing terms, two different target markets. So the first part of my business was when I first started, I was only thinking about after a death services. And this involves helping clients after a death figure out what to do, when to do, including are there any deadlines, and how to solve the tasks ahead of them, especially since they may not have encountered any or many of these tasks. For each person, these tasks typically are very different. The combination of losing a spouse, partner, or parent, as well as serving as the executor of that person's estate with its myriad of complex tasks and deadlines, can be overwhelming for many people. Several years later, people came to me and kind of, when they'd heard that message, kind of got what I call sort of frightened a little and said, oh my gosh, there would be two cases. One would be, we've put together some documents for the person who will take over. We think we're okay, but there might be holes. Can you work with us and see where our holes are and tell us what we need to do to fill in the holes? And the other one was, oh my gosh, we've done nothing. And what you're telling us has really frightened us. And we really need to get on board here and start putting together this kind of information for the one who needs to take over, whether it's due to incapacitation, short-term or long-term, or death. So I call this second service that evolved major service offering. I was a marketeer, so I talk in terms of service offerings. Is called Before Death Service. And this service offering involves working with each client so they develop their own customized set of documents specific to their situation, with all the information their loved one, other family member, or in some cases a friend, because if someone's single and they don't have close relatives nearby, or there aren't any living relatives because they have a small family, that so I use the term friend sometimes, will need should they either become incapacitated or die, and that most people don't realize, and in many cases haven't even thought about, and hence don't include in their end of life planning. So I have one example I'd like to share with your audience, just a quick one. One of many lists, if that's okay.
Absolutely, that'd be great.
Okay. So I'll call it the doctor/drug list. I'll tell you this, that mine is, and I don't even take drugs. I mean, basically, other than over-the-counter stuff. So there's lots of more detail that I'm not even we don't have time to talk about. But it's a list that I carry with me in my wallet. It's a list that I have 5 other places, including the glove compartment of my car for EMS. God forbid I have a car wreck, and several other places, as well as my sister and brother, who each live on, one lives on the East Coast, one lives on the West Coast, have copies of. So what's really important in that doctor or drug list is obviously a list of your doctors, a list of your drugs, but it's also the level of detail that needs to be included in this document to be useful. It also includes the fact that this document needs to be continuously updated immediately after each piece of the data changes. So if you go to the doctor, you can't wait a week to just say, okay, they changed the prescription or they increased the dosage of something, I'll get to it next week, and next week doesn't come and you forget about it. So, and then you have to make sure that you distribute it wherever you want it distributed to, including, as I say, your wallet. And I'll tell you why that's important to, somewhere, either if not in here, remind me and I'll tell you why at the end. And the number of, and as I talk about the number of places a printout of this document needs to reside, and not on a phone or in a computer for a loved one, reside 1 for a loved one, 2 for a family member or friend, as well as for EMS. EMS doesn't have a lot of time. I will tell you this, I've listened to a zillion now EMS people on various Zoom calls. And when they talk about coming to someone's home or an accident, they don't have time to go looking on phones or figuring out if you filled in your emergency contacts and things like that. So to make sure that that you do have your emergency contacts filled in, and that if you do have, let's say, a note that says, go look at my my glove compartment, then, or you have signed up for what's called smart 911.com, which is a national free service paid for by each city or geographic area that subscribes to it. So I live in Sandy Springs, Georgia. They've subscribed to it. Several other places in Metro Atlanta have, but not all places have. But that's a great way to keep all of that information. And so it has to be immediately accessible, especially in a crisis when it's needed, and whatever. So people really have, so there's really a lot to learn here. It's just not like make a list of your doctors and your drugs, or your vaccination. And people don't even think of your vaccinations, your allergies, all this kind of stuff. So that's what I talk about in terms of the level of detail.
What I appreciate that example, and I assume that's just one small example of the broad scope of everything that you would cover in an engagement with a person or a family you're working with, correct?
Minuscule. However, I do put it close to of all the things that we talk about, it's not at the very top. Things like advanced directives and stuff like that, the real legal documents are all at the top of my list of, things I want to talk to people about, but it's not far down from there, because I think it's so vital, because we never know what can happen to us. And, I guess, let me interject now. Let me talk about my husband's wallet and things like that, because this is really vital. When he had his heart attack, it was not expected, and I was about to, call EMS, and because he said to me, one of the last words he actually spoke to me was, I think I'm having a heart attack. And then he did say, get a piece of paper and a pencil. I'm going to tell you what drugs I had today. They're going to ask you that at the hospital, and get my wallet. And so I did. And he quickly told me the drugs he had taken. And obviously this is way before I had my business. So that's why I insist upon people thinking about creating this kind of list. I never force people to do stuff, but I tell them why. And when I got to the hospital, I gave them they did ask me first thing, what has he had today? So because we don't want any, conflicts here in terms of medications or allergies or whatever. And then the other reason I finally did learn why I took his wallet, and the reason that he told me that was because he knew that the next thing they ask you is, what's your insurance? And rather than tell me what it was, he knew the card was in his wallet. So yeah.
Oh.
People have no idea the volume of information they really need to give their loved one. It's just incredible. It is incredible. And if you start now, for retirement. You don't have to spend your retirement doing it. So, yeah.
Well, I'm just floored by your husband's presence of mind in a situation like that to tell you to, hey, grab a pen or pencil, write this down, and grab my wallet. That
was amazing, for which I feel very blessed. But I think in my introduction, I did say he was an international FDA and regulatory affairs consultant. So he was heavily involved in the ethical drug industry and teaching people how to get their drugs through the FDA. So the good news is everything I read now about COVID vaccines and how they're getting FDA approval and all this is all vocabulary I know and I don't have to look up. So it's kind of a blessing.
So I think you've begun to give us a good foundational idea of the work you do, the people you work with, the scope of services, as well as the level of detail you get into. But from a more, to give our listeners kind of maybe a more practical example, or to draw maybe a clearer picture, could you maybe share a favorite client success story from your work over the last several years?
Yeah, absolutely. I made some notes about this because I wanted to give you something I think to the audience will seem unusual, but I want to tell you that almost every client has their own issues, very different. Would I have ever expected somebody to call me for this kind of service? No, but I knew how to do it. And I'm going to talk about that and what happened. So I want people to understand that it's every client is unique and every consulting assignment is very different. So I've chosen after a death consulting assignment just because I had a good example. I could have chosen a before a death consulting assignment, but I chose an after a death one. One of my clients was, I was going to say, because she thinks we're so successful, she hasn't needed to call me back, but I'll say is the mother of one of my neighbors here in Atlanta. She lived in South Africa most of her life, married, and had 2 sons. One of her sons lives next door to me. After her husband died, and if I remember correctly, she and her husband were both in their late 50s or 60s when he died, so reasonably young. Also, she later met one of her late husband's business associates who lived in South Florida. After a whirlwind romance, they married. However, he was much older than she was and later suffered from ill health. After she died, she called me to say she wanted to become a client, but I couldn't imagine why she wanted my help because she was now twice widowed. And I thought she had, quote, been there, done that, referring to all the after death tasks. I initially had no idea what I could share with her that she didn't already know. She then told me what she needed my help with was to know what the difference between what she needed to do here in the United States after death was what one needed to do in South Africa. So at first, I had no idea how I would learn what one needed to do in South Africa in a timely and cost-effective manner. However, after pondering her request for a few minutes, I realized I did not need to know what one needs to do in South Africa. I only needed to tell her what she needed to do here. I also told her that at our in-person meeting, if I started to mention something she already knew, she should just tell me to skip this task and for me to move on, which I did. So as a result, my preparation for our meeting consisted of putting together a customized list of initial things she might need to do. I then met with her after I'd done all of this preparation work. I then met with her for a few hours, number one, going over the tasks I felt based on her own specific situation she needed to do. Number two, asking her questions along the way. And three, adding a few more things she needed to do based on our discussions to her list. She was thrilled with this consulting session. She not only told me my prep time and our meeting time was well spent, but also that the topics, the detail, and the direction of what she wanted to know, as well as what she needed to do to move forward after the death of her second husband in terms of tasks, was exactly what she wanted to learn. So who would have expected I would have had something as unique as this?
Yeah, that's
consulting engagement. Yeah. But it was fun. I mean, it was fun. It was interesting, for both of us. And I was really happy that she was happy.
Well, yeah, of course. Happy clients are kind of what makes our work all worthwhile. But another couple of ideas or questions that came to mind hearing you describe that, Ronnie. How do your clients typically find you? Is it just word of mouth? I mean, I know you mentioned in that one example that it was the mother of one of your one of your neighbors.
Oh, yeah. Good question. One, I never know until I ask them. And I don't have, I can't say that one, I'm going to give you some ways, but that one way works better than another. But coming from a sales and marketing background, I try and go broad and deep in terms of networking within professionals within the senior industry who work in the senior industry, networking in terms of speaking engagements in a variety of places, in organizations, including faith communities, general organizations, social, non-social organizations within, various communities, doing speaking engagements now over Zoom, as well. It used to be in person. Just a variety of people. I mean, because this is a kind of business where almost anybody is a prospect. Something I used to be able to narrow the prospects down. And yes, in a sense I can, because it's after death consulting, it's usually, a relative or a friend of somebody who's died. But before death consulting is really anybody. So there's no one good way. I just feel like I just keep building a huge contact database, of people that I've met along the way who seem to be interested in either one or both aspects of my business. And even if they don't give me business, as my late husband used to say when he was well, when we would talk about sales and marketing, everybody has a cousin, friend, brother, sister, colleague, and so you just never know. So when the phone rings, I have, sometimes no idea how they found me. Sometimes I do, but I just kind of keep, putting stuff out there.
Yeah.
And getting my name out there, and especially not only the name of my business, because the name isn't probably the best, but it was the best we could do at the time. Some friends and I worked on it for a long time, so that people know what I do. So I'm also really appreciative that you asked me to do this today.
Yeah, well, I'm happy. I'm happy to be able to share our conversation with our listeners. You and I've known each other for a few years now, and I've always been fascinated by the work that you do. So I'm happy to give you a small platform to, share a little bit more detail about, what it is you do and who you do it for.
Thanks. I also want to say that I really feel that Zoom has also been a great vehicle. So there are sometimes I now go to industry meetings or other types of meetings. And because we're on Zoom, there are people there from all over all over. And I've met a ton of people that way that I would never have met otherwise, and formed relationships because we've continued talking or getting to know each other after that one particular Zoom call. So, and I also think it's giving back. I mean, that's the other thing, volunteering. I didn't talk about that, but I'm a real believer in volunteering and giving back, but doing it with things that one really supports, so that it's an enjoyable situation. As well as sometimes I just come across something and I think it's really interesting for somebody I know, a business colleague, and I just send them a quick email and say, you might be interested in this, to further cement the relationship, because this is all about relationships.
Yeah, and mentioning Zoom, I'm curious. I know you're based here in the Atlanta area, as am I. But do you work just with people here locally, or can you work with people remotely as well?
I work with people remotely all the time. I finally, I said to myself, I have to learn how to be a host, and so I do that. I work with people remotely, and what makes it nice is because you can actually see the person you're working with. Because before Zoom, I would work with people remotely, but it was all by straight telephone. So now I can see their face, and we have more relationship, and I love it. Yeah,
that's nice. Well, as you know, and our listeners know, this is Women's Retirement Radio. So much of what we cover, we want to kind of tie into retirement and retirement planning, especially as it relates to women. So Ronnie, I'm curious, when you think of the word retirement, what comes to mind for you personally?
And preparing for today, I thought of like two words that come to me, and then I want to detail out what they mean to me. The first of the two things is financially and the importance of financial planning. And secondarily, on a personal level, retirement means having a plan for what you want to do with your life during retirement, as well as what did I write here? Should a spouse partner die, be incapacitated, or there be a divorce? So those were sort of the two topics. So if you give me a couple minutes, let me tell you some other notes that I wrote down to sort of flesh out what I mean by this.
Sure.
So financially, and the importance of financial planning means to me not only for how one will have a comfortable retirement and be able to do the things one wants to do, but also to plan for the rising cost of long-term care, which can be huge. So as an example, my mother, who I mentioned, lived in Rhode Island and had Lewy body dementia for 12 years. And at that time, 12 years was considered an incredibly long time. Not so much now. It's I can't say it's as common, but it's more common. And she was able to stay at home for the first 3.5 years with my father. Later, it was determined they both needed assisted living, so they moved there and lived in assisted living facility for 2 years. But during that time, during, I guess, the last 6 months, my father had a heart attack, 3 strokes, and another heart attack in a 6-month period. To be honest, each time we thought he was going to die. Because they now both needed a higher level of care, they moved to a nursing home called Steer House, Steere House in Rhode Island, where my father lived for 3.5 more years, and my mother lived for 6.5 years, all due to what I call great care. It was also a nonprofit nursing home, but just a phenomenal place. This experience reminds me to periodic of their long-term care and the costs involved and things like that. And my mother died second, which was in 2007. My father died in 2003, so a long time ago. This experience reminds me to periodically run Genworth's cost of care. So for our listeners, if they want to go to this website, if you just put in Genworth cost of care, you'll get to it. You'll see their survey to not only learn what the cost of care will be in, let's say, 20 or 25 years, as long you can set it up to roll out in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, whatever you want. And I tend to run it every few years, just to see where things are. But I ran it just a few months ago, and I learned that the cost of long-term care from today until I think I did 25 years out would actually double. And so it also reminded me to continually plan for my long-term care premiums, to pay them and to know that they're going to probably rise continuously. So when I talk about financial, I really think that, this concept of planning for 4 years of long-term care, which was sort of the mantra way back when, I think my parents were ill, is not enough. And I knew that. So I've planned for quite a bit longer through a variety of vehicles. So some long-term care insurance and some my own finances. So those are the two parts of financing. And secondly, on a personal level, where retirement means having a plan for what you want to do with your life during retirement, as well as should God forbid, a spouse partner be incapacitated, die, or there be a divorce. I want to tell another story because I also think stories are important, which came about after grieving the death of my husband. I began to focus on finding things in people, and when I talk about people in this example, I mean communities of people that make me happy. So it was about 1.5 years after my husband died, and I stopped crying every day. Doesn't happen to everybody, but it did to me. And I didn't cry all day, every day, but it seemed every once in a while I'd cry because I truly loved him. I suddenly realized I was feeling better and wondered why. When I examined my life, I realized I had created a new life based on what I now call a 3-legged stool, or a foundation based on 3 communities of people. I viewed one leg of my stool as my work, meaning my Bereavement Navigator business. Another leg was my involvement in my faith community. I'm a pretty active member of my synagogue. And And the third leg was my volunteer work with an organization here in Atlanta called Assistance League. It's Atlanta, meaning the Atlanta chapter. It's a community of approximately 250 women and some men, sometimes spouses, sometimes not spouses, whose mission, and the mission of Assistance League is to help women and children in need. Funds to do this work come through their thrift store called Attic Treasures, if you live here in Metro Atlanta, on Broad Street in a town called Chamblee, Georgia, just north of Metro Atlanta, where we all are involved in some capacity, either working in the warehouse, kind of like at Goodwill when you drop stuff off, managing a department, meaning, could be children's clothes or the men's department, working in the store at the register or on the floor or on some project that brings in revenue. For example, I sell all the real gold and sterling silver that comes to the store to private companies who buy their gold and silver because we get more money than if we just sold a 14-karat gold ring, because we could never sell it in the thrift store for what it's really worth. Hence, I then viewed my life as what I call a balanced three-legged stool with three very different purposes and communities, each of which enriches my life and contributes to building my personal, and in parenthesis, non-financial legacy. So that's what I call the personal part of retirement.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. And before I forget, by the way, I know you've mentioned a couple of resources in our conversation so far, like Smart 911,
Yep.
The Genworth Cost of Care survey, which is actually a tool that I often use with my clients. And then you most recently mentioned this. Tell me again, it's Assistance League Atlanta. Great.
And you can just Google that too, and up will come with the website. And if you click on the menu tab at the top, click on thrift store, you'll see all the information.
Yeah, I appreciate that. The reason I mentioned those is we'll be sure to include links to each of those resources in the show notes for this episode as well, so anyone that's listening can get to them pretty quickly and easily.
Okay. And if after this, if you want to call me and remind me, I'll just send you the direct links. I'm happy to do that. So
okay, perfect.
Make it easy for you.
Yeah, perfect. So from your perspective, Ronnie, both as a woman, but also in the work that you do through Bereavement Navigators, what do you consider one of the biggest challenges that women face, or that's specific to women when they're planning for retirement?
Okay. A couple of things. Not realizing there are two components related to a successful retirement, the financial component and the emotional or personal component that I just talked about. I don't think people think of that. Sometimes people just think of, oh, what trips are we taking, or, what are we doing? But there's really, planning for this retirement in terms of financially. And okay, so even if we have the money, what are we going to do for all these years? Because we're living longer. The emotional component also refers to, like what I said, what we'll do with their time for X years into the future that will make them happy. I feel when planning this part of retirement should consist of several activities a person enjoys, so not as to rely on one activity or one person to make them happy. Also, if the woman is married or in a relationship, what will retirement look like, not only financially, but emotionally, if the husband, spouse, partner dies before retirement? Meaning, will these activities carry you forward? Will you have community? We have to build new community, things like that. Also, will there be more or less money available? If more money, when will it, one, be available, and two, financially the best time to access it now or later? So, for example, because my husband and I were in our early 60s, I could collect Social Security because you could start collecting, I guess, when you're a widow. I think it's 60. But was it financially feasible to do that, or should I just take the money that I had and live off of that for a number of years, and let the Social Security monies just keep increasing, because I knew that, costs increase, et cetera, and that maybe, sacrifice a little now for more comfort later. So that's one thought. And so number two, for example, I found that there's still a significant number of women who don't realize if their husband dies, there won't be two Social Security incomes each month. And while some women may, while some women may have more money after the death of a spouse or partner due to, say, an inheritance, the question they should immediately investigate is, based on their own new needs, how long will this new money to them last, and if it isn't enough, then what happens, and to plan for that also. So I think those are what I consider some of the things that really come to top of mind for that women face when planning for retirement.
Yeah, and I appreciate that perspective. And it's interesting, a word that I keep hearing come up throughout our conversation, and I'm not surprised by this, is this idea of planning. So it seems to permeate a lot of what you do in your work, Ronnie. It certainly is a key element of the work that I do with my clients. And we were talking before we started recording about how there's a difference between having a plan versus ongoing planning.
Yeah.
We were kind of, I think, kind of joking about the fact that, a plan is only as good as, as what you know today. But clearly, as life happens and evolves and things change, some of those changes you can anticipate and see coming. Many of them you cannot. Mm-hmm. I think that just emphasizes the need to have a degree of vigilance and to regularly look at all this stuff, whether it's your doctor and drug list that you keep in your wallet, in your car, and the other places you mentioned, or your financial plan, or the other elements of, planning pre or post-death, items that need to be addressed. So I just wanted to highlight that, because I think that's a really key takeaway from our conversation today, among many others.
Yeah. And Russ, I really like your word vigilance, because I think, people, when they think of planning, they do it in terms of a task, whatever, or a series of tasks. But they say, well, the task is done, I'm done. And then they never keep revisiting it. It's, nothing for me to just, I go to the doctor, I come home, I know if there's any pill changes or, even vitamin, not because I do a lot of non-prescription stuff, but, even vitamins or whatever, maybe they up the milligrams or something, just do that right then and there. Just do it, update the list and distribute them or whatever, and just be done, because people don't think about what happens if, somebody has to take over for you, or a doctor you go to the hospital, God forbid, and somebody looks at your list and it's not updated. They can only go with what they see. And nobody, and I really think that high percentage of people don't realize that concept,
Yeah, I think whether someone hires me for financial and retirement planning, or hires you for consulting around, pre or post death, or other short or long-term disability, or other similar situations, I think there's a huge, taking that first step is a huge benefit and a huge accomplishment. But none of this is set it and forget it. It does require
set it and forget it. Exactly. Yeah. We're that's why we're friends. We're on the same page here.
Yeah.
But yeah.
So Ronnie, how would you say that your work and the things you do through Bereavement Navigators, how does that impact women and their families as they plan for or make the transition into retirement?
I think that my before death service offering, part of my business, is really designed to help people document, as I've tried to allude to, all the things their spouse, partner, family member, or friend will need should they become incapacitated or, God forbid, die. My hope is by doing this work, they will be at peace. That's, I think, what I hopefully will give them if they will do this work, and can not only them, but their spouse, partner, family member, or friend, and that they can truly enjoy their retirement without the need to do this end of life planning work hanging over their head during retirement. Do it, as you're planning for retirement, just think of this as a series of tasks, and we take it one at a time, kind of in the order of importance, and, just go do it, because it's not something you can do in 20 minutes, unfortunately, if you do it well. And, and the other thing is, I always think to people, don't you want to be remembered, how do I want to word it? Don't you want to have good memories of the one who was left behind, as opposed to, oh, why didn't they do this or that, to have made my life easier?
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's the consequences, really. A lot of times people are really upset or angry with their loved one, after death, and they shouldn't. They should just have good memories, and that's what I want to give them.
Yeah, and I you could probably correct me if I'm wrong here, but I would also anticipate there's some kind of cognitive dissonance around the fact that people need to think about, plan, address these things, hopefully well ahead of the time that they actually need to, be acted upon. I'm thinking specifically around like pre-death planning, but of course, I think it's a pretty common knowledge here. No one likes to think about their own mortality or that of their partner, spouse, family, and friends. So I would imagine I would imagine it's often difficult for people to take that first step to say, okay, I realize I need to work on this, and I'm going to reach out to Ronnie, for example, to get some help with it. So
and it is. And what I try and tell people, I like to reframe it a little. I say we're working on tasks. We're not working on death. We're working on tasks. And because when you think of your doctor drug list, what is it? It's a doctor drug list. We're not talking about why we're doing it. We're talking about we're just doing it.
Yeah.
And my doctor always likes to say when she has to deal with or was talking about death, as she says, we're all biological beings. Just like the fly in the room today. We're all biological beings. Don't people realize this? And I feel, yes, we don't always realize this, and no, we don't want to think about it all the time, but we can think about lists and gifts that we're giving and feel good about giving this gift to our loved ones.
Yeah. I think that's a great way to kind of start wrapping up the conversation. But I'd like to share with our listeners a little bit more about you personally, Ronnie. So when you've got, I know you're busy, both with your company and the communities that you share with us, but when you've got a little time to yourself, let's say an hour or two, how do you most enjoy spending your time?
Pricing all the pins and rings that are donated to Assistance League Atlanta's thrift sporadic treasures, which I previously mentioned, and selling the gold and the silver. I love doing that kind of stuff. I come from a jewelry family. It was custom jewelry in Rhode Island in the 1950s and early 60s. My grandfather owned a jewelry store. My father was in jewelry for a good part of his working life. He did some other things too, but he did that. So jewelry for me, especially pins and rings, have always been my passion.
Interesting. And just out of curiosity, since that's an ongoing, project that you're involved with, I mean, how many hours does that typically take a week for you?
It could be forever, because we get Assistance League is a great place to donate stuff, and so we get a lot. So sometimes it ebbs and wanes, but I tend to do it sometimes while watching TV. So like everybody else on the jewelry team who prices necklaces or bracelets, we do it in sort of like odd hours. It's not like I devote time. And in fact, I have tons of pins and rings to price right now because I've been really busy with work and other things in my life. So but we'll call it my hobby.
Got it. That's interesting. I'm glad you shared that. So Ronnie, we've covered a lot today. I've thoroughly enjoyed the conversation, as I always do when you and I get a chance to catch up. If there were one thing our listeners could take away from our conversation today, what would you want that one thing or one idea to be?
I think while planning for retirement, to include time during retirement or even before retirement to gather the information your spouse, partner, other family member, or friend will need after your death. I just can't stress that enough. It can be the greatest gift you can give yourself, because when completed, as well as when you continuously update the information as needed, it will not only bring you peace, but also after your death, it will hopefully do likewise for whomever takes over for you, be it your spouse, partner, family member, or friend. If you do this, then truly know that after your death, if they could, they would thank you.
What a great and important note to kind of wrap things up on. Before we wrap it up for good today, Ronnie, is there anything else you want to cover or address? Anything I didn't ask you that you wish I would have today?
Yeah, just a couple of things. Over the past 6 months, the number of requests I've received for my speaking engagements has increased significantly. In fact, recently I've been invited by 4. I think this today 5 organizations to speak to their members. The title of my most popular and requested presentation is called Making Advanced Care Planning Easier with a Georgia Pulse. That's spelled POLST, and it stands for Physician Order for Life-Sustaining Treatment. Over the years, I've also presented state-specific versions of this speech in Colorado, Florida, and Tennessee. I just think especially people who are on Medicare, the PULSE, the Physician-Ordered Life-Sustaining Treatment document, gives you many more options than Section 2, the treatment preference section of the Advanced Directive, as your in terms of your health wishes at end of life. And I talk about the differences between the two documents, why you need both documents, and how to get not just all A, all B, or all C, as it is written in the Advanced Directive, but to have as many combinations and permutations as you would like. So that's as I said, my most popular and requested speaking engagement. So if anybody's interested, they can contact me. And I'd also like your audience to know that I'm always happy to speak to any organization, family group, or group of friends who will provide a Zoom host and have, I sometimes like to say guarantee, but have 10 or more people in attendance. And that my 23-page electronic handout, sometimes called a workbook on this topic, I send to the Zoom host for further dissemination to all registered attendees a few days before the presentation, so that everybody can print it out and so they can easily follow along while I'm speaking, and they can take notes on it because it's just totally packed with information that more than they could actually read on a screen, but therefore they don't have to take notes of what's on the screen. They can just write notes on the document. So if anybody's interested in getting a group together or know of a group, I'm happy to do that.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. And just to clarify for folks that aren't familiar with the term Advanced Directive, that's more commonly referred to as a living will. But to Ronnie's point, the PULSE document can be a great addition or actually serve in place of the Advanced Directive or living will in many cases. So definitely encourage our listeners to look further into that.
One caveat is it really only replaces Section 2, not replaces, but it's complementary to, that's the word we like to use, complementary to Section 2, the treatment preference section of the Georgia Advanced Directive. So you still need the other sections because, as you know, there's the naming a healthcare agent, disposition of body, several other 3 other sections beside the treatment preference section. So you need both.
Got it. Thanks for clarifying that.
Yeah.
So Ronnie, I'm sure people listening to this are probably going to be interested in learning more. And I know you mentioned that you do speaking for groups on Zoom or to community or other organizations. What would be the best way for someone to reach out to you to learn more, to perhaps schedule a time to speak with you or learn about your speaking services, things like that?
My website is www.bereavementnavigators.com, spelled BEREAVEMENTNAVIGATORS, bereavementnavigators.com. And if anyone has a question, I really prefer people to call me and I'll tell you why in a minute, at 404-843-9460. Again, 404-843-9460. So I can quickly answer any questions they may have either about me or my business. And because I found that one question typically leads to another. So rather than engaging in numerous rounds of long explanatory emails, which I really don't have time to do, it is easier and faster for both the caller and me to have a brief telephone conversation, which I'm happy to do. And in many cases, what someone might think is just a quick question really is not, does not have a short and maybe a short question, maybe a quick, I want to say it this way, is a quick question, but maybe not have a short and quick answer. In addition, if interested, I'm also happy to provide anyone who calls me with my extensive one-page bio document. It's a more extensive description of my background and my business offerings than what is currently on my website. and also another document, what I call my value-added document, titled Suggested Gifts for a Widow, Widower, or an Adult Child when you want to help and don't know what meaningful things you can do for someone after the death of a loved one. It was all the things that people creatively did for me, and I just decided I'd document them in sort of a time order, meaning like at death, a few days after death, a month later, etc. Things that you could do that, and none of them, most of them are free. I think the most expensive thing on there is a box of manila file folders, because you're going to need that for all the paperwork that you have lying around your desk. And that costs under $25, probably the most expensive thing on the list.
Yeah. Well, as I mentioned earlier, we'll be sure to share a link to your website as well as some of the resources that you mentioned during our conversation. And I just want to say thanks, Ronnie. This has been great. Always enjoy speaking with you, and happy to be able to share our conversation today with our listeners.
Thanks ever so much for having me. I always love talking with you. It's just great and easy, and you ask very creative questions. So thank you.
Yeah, well, thanks. And thanks to all of you out there listening. Again, this has been another episode of Women's Retirement Radio, and I look forward to catching up with you on our next episode. It's Russ again. And before you go, I want to provide a brief disclosure. You should consult a financial advisor familiar with the specific circumstances of your unique financial situation before making any financial decisions. Nothing in this broadcast constitutes a solicitation for the sale or purchase of any securities. Any mentioned rates of return are historical or hypothetical in nature and are not a guarantee of future returns. I'm a financial advisor and an investment advisor representative of WealthCare Capital Management, LLC, an SEC-registered investment advisor based in Richmond, Virginia. The views discussed in this podcast are my own and may not be consistent with or represent those of WealthCare Capital Management.